And first, before I turn it over to the speakers, I'm going to mute everybody in the room. And we are now ready to begin. Let me know when you'd like to have the PowerPoint pulled up. Here, I'll unmute both of you.
Okay.
We're unmuted?
There we are. Yes.
Excellent.
Okay, thanks.
And we're just waiting for the PowerPoint, right?
Yes, I could do that right now.
Great. Well, welcome everybody. We are going to be talking today about preserving modern resources, and our thesis that we're going to be going through is that some of the key defining characteristics of modern architecture, what the modern architects were, the sort of basis of their design, the things that these architects and planners were really focusing on in their work, that those actual elements which define modern architecture are actually now the things that we're finding make those sites particularly vulnerable to threats, to change, to demolition. So in our presentation, we are going to, let me advance. We are going to be looking at these key principles, and we will be providing a broad range of examples of why we believe these defining characteristics are what is really impacting the preservation of modern architecture today. So some of the key principles that we're going to be focusing on, the idea that modern architecture was a socially driven movement. It was a movement that was done at a time in which society was changing rapidly and architects were trying to solve big social problems with their buildings, with their design. But what happens now when society is changing? Society is completely changed. How does that affect those sites? The second principle is the fact that modern architects were obsessed with the honest expression of materials and structures and really pushing structural design to the limits. And what happens now when those materials fail? How do we address that? The third is that there was a big focus on the integration of outdoors and indoors, the integration of architecture and landscape together, to have buildings be open and feel like they're open to the landscape. But now we've got big issues with climate change, with the need to conserve energy. Do these kinds of moves, the connection of architecture and landscape, of openness to the outdoors and transparency, are they environmentally sound things that we can still practice today? And finally, the idea of form following function was really a modern principle, and one that defined the appearance of most modern buildings. But what happens now when those building functions are obsolete have completely changed?
Great. So I'm going to first talk a little bit about the historic context of modern architecture and how it really did come out of these social and cultural movements and changes. So as many of you know, I'm sure, we're reviewing here, after World War I and going into the Great Depression in the early 1930s, people in cities mostly, is kind of the focus of a lot of things we're looking at. City life was not great for a lot of people. We had excessive slums, people living in crowded, very difficult conditions in a lot of our major U.S. cities. This is a picture from a tenement in New York City about 1930. And, as a result of conditions such as the Depression and things that really led to poverty and all sorts of, questioning of our economy and society and these huge changes after World War I, by the time we move into World War II, there's this real fear that has evolved. And I love these propaganda posters. They're crazy, but just people were terrified. They had seen World War I happen. They lost family members. World War II, there was this real fear that there was going to be a Nazi invasion of the United States, and people were, frightened, and it really, infiltrated every part of society. And out of that, quickly skipping over, people responded together, and the home front became a really important thing. It became the people back at home supporting the people overseas, and not only securing the home front, which we see a lot here in California, securing the Pacific coast, but also providing support to the people who were abroad, and really just, it really solidified a movement in society in a way that hadn't happened before. And so out of that, you get this idea of, okay, well, the war is over now. We're just, rapidly skipping through history here. There's this great optimism that came after World War II. This idea of the American dream, and that people could really achieve that. And a lot of it had to do with the way that, women's roles were changing during the World Wars, and, showing advances in technology that in many ways the wars propagated, really started to change people's idea of society and kind of how they're living in the United States. And this idea, in California, of the California dream, was already established prior to World War II. We have these awesome, fruit box artworks that are shown here that just really showed how people had this idea that California was this utopia. And a lot of people were stationed here during the war and chose to stay here after the war, or move their families here because they saw it as a new frontier in an area to really start this new life in the American dream. Now that migration west was absolutely facilitated by the kind of federal highway system that was sort of at its, start in the 1950s. And that change alone rapidly changed our cities and our connection across the United States. So we start to see these social changes we're talking about start to kind of show up in the design world. And they start in Europe with, things like Le Corbusier's work that he did in the 1920s. Here is the, iconic city planned, slapped down onto the urban environment. We start to see these new ideas about how cities can evolve and how we can design them. Here's an example in Los Angeles, is Park La Brea, which is done in the mid-1940s, kind of during World War II and after. And again, we see these large-scale, design moves made on cities, and was San Francisco before World War II, and the Beaux-Arts urban plaza in front of the City Hall building you see there in the center. They ripped it all out. a public urban shared space that people are creating with the modern design aesthetic being applied. Here's just another photo of that. And then Andrew's going to talk about this example.
But actually, why don't we talk a little bit about the Fulton Mall and what's happening, the future of the Fulton Mall? Because I think one of the things that we're trying to look at here is there is this move in this modern period, the idea that architecture and site planning can really improve and change society for the better. That if you clear the slums, these places that were tenements and people were living in bad conditions, and you build these high-rise buildings, suddenly people are going to be living in much better conditions, that you've got light and air, and we're going to have a great new society. And what we know now is obviously that, that obviously wasn't true, but that also architecture probably has a limited role to really impact society. And the reason for this Fulton Mall was the city center in Fresno was the businesses were leaving, there was suburban flight, so they said, well, let's create this pedestrian street and we'll solve these problems. And that the problem wasn't really the design of the street. The problem was other economic issues related to development and suburbanization and big box retail that's really affected that. So now the city is looking at it thinking like, well, this is a problem. We're not getting an active streetlight here. We need to rip this mall out to go back to a more traditional street pattern. And that will once again save our city.
That's the current proposal. So yeah, we see these cyclical changes and ideas about how the design can solve the social problem, which was very much part of the kind of philosophy in the modern era, and it's problematic now because for the same reasons, ripping these places out does not solve the social issues. So it's interesting. Did you want to talk about?
Yeah, I do, but I mean, I guess the final comment I want to make about that is I think what we would see as a more positive development is rather than saying let's rip out all the redevelopment that was done and these big modern sites, is let's look at more incremental change. How can we take the things that were good about some of these developments, because actually there was a lot of good design in some of these developments. How can we take those things that are good and build on them and incrementally change them rather than now ripping them out, because there is a tendency now for planners and city officials to blame the design of these developments as saying, well, that they failed, let's demolish them completely. They're not working for society. And we're saying, well, let's look at it in a kind of smaller scale movement. Let's not make the same mistakes that were done when some of these developments were done, which obviously they were very harmful to cities. What we also see in this period is the development of large-scale both campus design and campus student centers, and the effort to do comprehensive planning for campuses. And the idea of a student center is something that had really been lacking on most campuses, that there would be a place for students to gather and to meet. And this is the Lower Sproul campus, the Lower Sproul Student Center at Berkeley by Vernon DeMaros and Hardison, won as a result of a competition, which was a large-scale collection of buildings, including performance buildings, student centers, student offices, dining halls, all gathered around this open plaza by Lawrence Halprin. And its original design intent would be that it would be a very active and inviting place, and composed of these modern brutalist style buildings, all done in concrete, built over a parking garage. So we're getting parking integrated as part of a student campus. And over time, what happened in this center is some of the things that were really beautiful about this place, like the dining hall with its lofty columns and skylights, that was turned mostly into student offices. So they took dining and no longer had a consolidated dining hall and have infilled most of that building, and then have made incrementally changes to this project which have really impacted its design, its character over time, making it less of a friendly place. And to a certain extent that parking garage over parking was always a pretty a plaza that never really worked that well in terms of student activity. And so now, and here you can see the way it looked until recently, that it was a pretty windswept plaza, this abstract concept of a plaza. So now what the university is in the process of is doing a complete rebuilding of Lower Sproul, saving some of the buildings but demolishing others and building a completely new student center. So it's really changing its character in many ways, but luckily they are saving some of the more significant structures.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the Martin Luther King building is getting these large additions to it, and there's a new structure that is tying them all together.
So another new kind of design typology that evolves out of this time period is the suburban housing development, which I'm sure all of you maybe grew up in one or have friends that live in these. As we were redesigning the city, we also saw this flight from the city in the 1950s and 60s. And as you can see today, there's actually this resurgence of people moving back into urban centers. But at this time, the automobile and kind of the transportation advances allowed for people to live outside of the city centers and commute to work. And so you see these grand master planned communities that are developed often, on pre-existing farmland or in California on former orchards, really changing the landscape of our country by creating these large areas and really sprawling the boundaries of the city outside to provide people with the types of housing they were interested in. They wanted a garden, they wanted a single family home that they could live in, and were no longer, wanting to live in tenements in these cities, and they no longer had to because there was more opportunity and financial security after the war to be able to enable this kind of development. We're showing some examples here of Anshin and Allen working for Eichler. This is in Orange, California. These really cute little, box houses that evolved. And the next one is...
I think we're actually going to the next section, but
okay.
One thing to add on here is one of the threats we're seeing on some of these developments is that they were architect designed and planned and had a very uniform layout of these low-slung buildings, which are very difficult to adapt, to add on to, because it really impacts the architecture quite a bit. If you add a second story onto an Eichler home, you're really impacting it. So, and also the fact that some of the character is from the uniformity of the developments that gives them their sort of defining characteristics. And a lot of homeowners have very individual ideas and want to change their houses, and that's creating an impact to the character of those developments.
Mm-hmm.
So architects were really focused on this idea that there had been a period, the world before this period was all about ornament defining buildings, that you could do art buildings in different styles, a classical style, a neo-Gothic, Egyptian style, and you would focus on those styles as defining the buildings. And modern architects believe very firmly that though the appearance of the building would really be driven by honestly expressing those structures and those materials, that it was kind of almost unethical to do buildings that were ornamented because that was not really an honest expression of what you were designing and of how the building stood up and how it was its appearance. And this is very clearly shown in Corbusier's idea of the domino house, that these building is very simply composed of platforms and columns, that the expression of structure would be the real thing that you see. And at this time as well, coming out of World War II, there was a really big interest in mass production, in the idea that the architecture should be kind of like a machine for living, that it should be related more to the way we were mass producing cars and airplanes and typewriters, that it shouldn't be so customized. It really should be something that is easily produced, that we could solve housing problems. In this period after World War II, there was a large housing crisis, And we needed to solve those problems, and that we would create these houses that then could just be kind of shipped all over the country. And also the idea that buildings could be like a kit of parts that could be easily erected. The Eames house, the famous Charles and Ray Eames house, was a case study house. The intent was that it was like a kit house, that it would be something that eventually could be reproduced in other places. And also in this post-war period, there's really this interest in industrial design, and that buildings are like machines. And I think this advertisement for your new Lincoln car relating to the lever house, and the idea that it's all part of the way you live, and that these things are very closely related. Planes, buildings, they're mass-produced, and they're kind of like machines. Even the design of things like thermostats, this concept that we're simplifying materials, we're simplifying everything to its kind of bare bones essential element. The beautiful thermostat shows that it's so simple and easily understandable. What this also led to was this idea that if we're honestly expressing materials, we needed to do it in the simplest, cleanest way possible. And we're going to make materials so super thin, so kind of simple, that we're just going to have those essential elements defining the buildings. And if you think about historic buildings, often like historic wood houses, for example, the building is built and then there's trim that's used to cover all the gaps. I mean, there's all these ideas about what you might have a cornice that's actually covering the joint between the roof, or a parapet that's covering the joint between the roof and the walls of the building has a cornice and a parapet. And now we're seeing architects saying, well, those are unnecessary features. Let's just design things to be extraordinarily kind of thin and clean. And what that means now is we're seeing that a lot of those technologies that they were using, the architects didn't really understand them. They were very experimental. Sometimes they weren't even meant to last, or that they were ones that the technology was not fully worked out. It was the first time it had been done. And you have Frank Lloyd Wright's concrete block houses needing extensive restoration work over many, many years and at huge cost. And what this kind of means is we can't all be spending the millions of dollars that Frank Lloyd Wright, the restoration of a Frank Lloyd Wright would cost on an ordinary structure. If you got simple school buildings, they're not going to be able to take that kind of investment. And so this is a big threat to a lot of buildings now, that you can't afford that kind of investment. And here's an example of Steinhaus Hall at UC Irvine. William Pereira designed most of the buildings of the UC Irvine campus, and they've got these fantastic brise-soleils made out of concrete. And a lot of these now have issues related to seismic condition or waterproofing. And the university is not particularly appreciative of Pereira's design, even though it is so distinctive. I think these are fantastic buildings. And so in this building recently, they said, well, we're keeping the building, but we're going to do a little modification. And if you note at the bottom of the slide, you can see that original railing that was there in that historic view. And that gives you some sense of what's happened to this building. They've stripped off the brise-soleil and done these very kind of flimsy aluminum brise-soleils. But that brise-soleil was the defining characteristic of the building. It's as if they've demolished the building because they've really taken everything that was kind of character defining of it off.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we've talked a lot about, just Andrew and I, when we're talking about this topic, is that it's a lot of these alterations that happen to try to modify the buildings that really destroy their integrity completely. So even though there's good intention of seismic stability and things like that, if the character of the building is a simple, box with some ornamental brise-soleils, you can't take away the brise-soleils and still have the same building. So it's the alterations are what we're seeing is really a problem in many cases, not just demolition, but also modification.
Right, and also because the detailing is often so minimalist in these buildings that even a small modification can have a fairly big impact. Mm-hmm. And here's an interesting case study in which here's the building in which SOM designed the seismic and the wind bracing to be exposed on the outside of the building. It's a very simple rectangular box with this X-bracing exposed to really show this is an engineered building. And recently the owner decided they wanted to do some voluntary seismic upgrades, and so they made some changes to the outside, and they've actually added, if you can see the slide at the left, it was just all X's, and now there's some horizontal members that have been added, so those perhaps are not that impactful. But at the ground floor, there was a very, very open ground floor. On the side of the left, you can see the building was kind of over this plaza. It was completely open at that level. And they've added these V-braces at the ground floor to provide better connections between the building and the ground. And that's had, I think, a pretty significant impact on the character of this rectangular volume being perched over the plaza. They've also done it in colors that are just like the same material and color as the original design, so I'm not sure that really would have met the Secretary of Standards in terms of an improvement that's differentiated. Mm-hmm. I mean, these kinds of improvements, I mean, seismic safety is important. There probably would have been a way to strengthen the original connections of those main vertical columns, but I think this was done because it was a less expensive way to do this alteration. Another building type that is these concrete buildings by Mario Campi, the idea of experimenting with cantilevered forms. If you think about falling water and the problems that it's had over many years, being able to maintain its structural integrity, settings like the University of California, they don't have the funds to really address these kinds of things. This building by Mario Campi on the Berkeley Art Museum, it was composed of a series of cantilevered cubic volumes sort of cascading down, and there's an open courtyard, an open atrium in the center. And in order to remedy the building's seismic deficiencies, but the university has not come up with a reuse plan for the building the art museum has moved out. They've placed these columns around the outside to help remedy that. And on the inside, there were all these cantilevered platforms, and they've actually added columns to the inside as well. And this is currently a temporary fix. It's not necessarily going to they'll be the long-term solution, but we're seeing that the building, the fact that it was an experimental building, that it used all these incredible cantilevered forms, that's really what defines the building, and yet it's also what's proving to be its greatest weakness, that the technology was pushed so quickly by Mario Campi in the late 60s that there are serious structural flaws to it now. Also, we see this a lot in the design of modern office buildings, that they're designed with these really simple curtain walls, these skins that define their exterior, that the architects were kind of just looking at what's the most honest expression of a building. I just want glass and columns. And the slide at the left is the original design of the Standard Bank in Los Angeles, and recently it's been reskinned. And even though that the changes are kind of minor in terms of the pattern of the mullions and the relationship of the verticals and the horizontals, it actually has kind of had a big impact on this building. It's no longer got the same distinctive characters as it did originally. Another Welton Beckett building in San Francisco had a very open ground floor plaza, and now that it was kind of a floating element, and now that's also been filled in. So these kinds of changes incrementally have a big impact on the design of these buildings. Sometimes we see buildings in which the exterior wall is really their defining characteristic. This is the sort of the expression of the building, and when those kinds of things are changed, it has a huge impact on the character of the buildings. Here there was a kind of sad attempt to maintain the crosses of that building and the curtain wall, but it's really destroyed its integrity. And the idea of these buildings as being the reader of this kind of expressing an open volume with the sunshade. Sun shading and environmental characteristics were actually very important to modern architects, protecting from the sun. We think about the environmental movement as if it is just a new and recent thing, but it was actually a big focus of a lot of architects' works. But then often these technologies, this type of concrete, was not really worked out in terms of how it would last. And this building by Pafford Keating Clay, if you'll note the position, kind of the main entry door on that slide, and the way the building appears now. It's actually the same building, but they have taken off all of the exterior concrete walls. And then a lot of architects were integrating artwork and art into their work, and creating, in this case, the use of really thin concrete, of all glass facades, and a lot of those materials are failing. And in the case where some of these institutions don't have the money to do renovations properly, we're seeing a big impact. So this Mario Campi building, you can see it had this beautiful concrete roof. On the left, you see the concrete roof and the integration of artwork into the facade. On the right, you see it in the course of construction. And so this was an all-glass facade. Now, if you look at it from above, you can see that there's still the concrete roof, but they've actually completely infilled that concrete facade. So there's very little intact original design.
Okay, so next we'd like to talk a little bit about landscape architecture. In the modern movement, first of all, the role of the landscape architect changed in the 20th century. There wasn't even a title of landscape architect, prior to the 20th century. It was, gardener and designer, but there wasn't really this professionalization of the landscape architecture field until, mid-20th century. Early to mid-20th century. In California, Thomas Church is often, touted as one of the first, official landscape architects that was working. He provided a lot of guidance and opportunities for the younger generations of landscape designers, and it was really through the work of that kind of class of landscape architects working after World War II, establishing their own practices in California, that we really start to see this integration of landscape with the buildings. And, prior to this, the modern landscape movement, you often saw gardens or, landscape gardens as something you look at, some Victorian garden that you see from a window of a castle. That's your, nature, which is very constructed. And in modern architecture, we start to see this shift to incorporating the outdoor spaces as part of the architecture. This year, I'm sure everyone studies this example in architecture school and design school. The German Pavilion by Mies van der Rohe, Barcelona Pavilion. He here was creating these outdoor rooms. This is a pool with a statue that was very much one of the most important spaces within the pavilion, that you're meant to be outdoors and integrating between the inside and outside almost seamlessly. The Villa Savoie, another iconic, European example, really one of the first examples of international style architecture. Again, the integration of the roof decks, the ground plane, and also this idea of the building as an object in the landscape is really apparent here. And then we see, Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian House. Again, there's this real focus on the landscape, a lot of attention paid to the landscape that we didn't always see in other previous examples. And then, a quintessential example is Falling Water, Frank Lloyd Wright's house in Pennsylvania that he worked on, where here it's all about the landscape. They built the building over top of this body of water, this stream that runs underneath the building, which is clearly leading to its preservation issues and its decay. But it was a real celebration of this site, and the building was very carefully constructed within that landscape on that site. And so how do you preserve that today when those features themselves are basically causing the building to fall down? And this, we know, is under constant state of repair, but a really, really important example of this idea. So we start to see in California, things like Richard Dion Neutra's VDL Research House. Again, they're creating these outdoor rooms, and you're really meant to enjoy these spaces and spend time in these outdoor spaces. This is a example from, I believe this is Robert Royston's book, Landscape for Living by Robert Royston. He's showing here that the family will be spending time outdoors. This idea of family in our suburban homes, he's really showing that the garden can be very simple, but can be a very important gathering space for a family to work and play. And then here at UC Santa Cruz, we see a larger scale master plan example of integrating landscape with the design. This campus was a former agricultural site and estate that was, granted to the state of California for the university. The entire university was built in the 1960s, and each of the colleges that make up the larger campus were designed to integrate into the existing agricultural landscape as well as the redwood groves that are on the site. And if you've ever been to this campus, it's amazing to walk around. There's actually hiking trails through the redwoods that kind of connect you from college to college, but yet it's modern architecture. It's very much quintessential modern architecture that they chose for the buildings. So it's this real juxtaposition between the organic, natural features and the kind of rigid, boxy architecture. It's really kind of an interesting case. And here we also see, during this time period, the idea of the landscape as a work of modern art. So often, I think this comes through when you look at something in an aerial. This is Santa Clara Central Park by Robert Royston, and here there's this idea of geometry and movement through the site. It looks like you could trace this, and it could be an abstract artwork that you can hang on your wall. Same for places like Park Merced. This is one example of a garden courtyard at Park Merced where the geomorphic lawns, literally this is composed of geomorphic lawns surrounded by, paving, sidewalks, and some foundation plantings. That's the entirety of the garden. It's all about the form and the shapes and the artistic expression of these features. Here again at Park Merced, this is another example. You see the iconic towers, the cruciform towers that very much reflect that early slide we showed of Le Corbusier's city plan against the garden apartments that have these landscape features, and the landscape features were as important as the buildings in terms of the overall plan of this site. And here's an example to show how, because of the simplicity of the original designs for these landscapes, the top left is a traffic circle at Park Merced, which the bottom right shows an example of a kind of incompatible alteration that I hear was done by like some random gardener that was working on the site. Here there's this loss of the intent of the simple, expressive, artistically expressed landscape by adding something that just really doesn't go with the aesthetic of the modern design.
But I would say also one of the reasons they're making these changes is because here we are, we're in a terrible drought. And this design, this beautiful, elegant, modern design of these ambiguously shaped lawns is not a sustainable design anymore. And so the easiest thing is, well, let's rip it out and we'll put some drought-tolerant plants, some cactus in, some succulents, and gravel, and that really changes the character of the design. So I think in these kinds of situations, it's really important to be more creative in the way we're looking at making these types of landscapes sustainable. And could there be a way that this landscape would be made more sustainable without really completely destroying its character-defining features? It's the simple planarity of the lawns and the shapes that are there. And this is something that we're seeing as a big threat to modern landscapes, because often they're just composed of these really simple elements. They're not They've got often large areas of lawn. They've got often large areas of very simple materials. And so then when you make these changes in the guise of sustainability, it has a big impact.
I'm looking at the comments on the left here. I appreciate everyone chiming in saying, yeah, it's a knee-jerk reaction to the drought. It's these changes are not done with any understanding of the history of this site and what is significant about the site and its design. It's just a response to a problem where, you know, we would say you need to look at what is significant about a site and then adapt some drought-tolerant plants that still look like lawn with a shrub in the middle. You know, you can still reflect that aesthetic without completely replacing every element of the design. So this is, you know, we'll talk about this more a little bit later, but it's an important point. I think there's one more.
Oh, yeah,
there's also, this is just an example to show, this is the Goldman House in San Francisco. It's a Joseph Eschrick building with a Doug Bayless landscape. There was these real, because of this integration of landscape architecture, these amazing partnerships developed between the modern architects and the modern landscape architects that I think is important to point out. They often worked together exclusively, or they had maybe one or two designers that they would work with, and they really elevated the role of the landscape architect to be equivalent to the architect. So for the Goldman House, that courtyard is where you enter from the street, you don't even know what's in there, and you walk into this entry courtyard, and it's that the building is designed to embrace and like address this courtyard space. It's a very important space to the house. And it's just an example of this mirroring of these two disciplines and the care in which it was done, which I think is really important. And a lot of that was because of the personal partnerships, you know, these really close relationships these designers had and how they were working together.
So why don't you talk a little bit about the permitting issues with these types of landscapes?
Oh, yeah. This is actually, this house has an amazing owner who understands the significance of it and is very much taking a preservation approach to it. But this house came through for a alteration to the building, and in speaking with the landscape architects, I asked them what the plan was for the garden, and they said, oh, well, we don't need any permits, so we weren't really going to have you guys review it, you know, because a landscape change, unless there is a retaining wall or a physical structure that the building department, at least in San Francisco or in many municipalities, unless there's a physical structural element that is going to be changed, that there's a potential for a safety issue or something, landscape changes often don't require permits. And so that often leads to the fact that things are changed and we don't even know about it, especially for, you know, private residential properties, which, you know, some people would argue it's a private residential courtyard, maybe we shouldn't have jurisdiction over it. But in this case, the owner then decided to bring the landscape design plan to us as well to make sure that all the changes were going to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards, so we're very happy about that. But a lot of times these get changed out and we don't even know, and so that relationship can be lost in a lot of cases with these types of buildings.
Yeah, so I think what the point really is that landscape is an important kind of integral feature of these modern sites, and yet it's rare that the landscape is protected. Even if you had a landmark building, the landscape may not be protected, and so then it's going to have a huge impact on the building,
right,
because of that close connection in design. The other thing is that this idea of linking of landscape and site was something that was happening especially through corporate campuses. There were lots of corporate campuses being built in Silicon Valley and lots of other places in California in this period. And the idea that these campuses would all be linked to the outside, that they would have lots of open space, was a kind of integral part, and the design of them would be as important as the design of the buildings. And so what we're seeing now as threats is that they're pretty low density. There's all this open space, and developers are looking and saying, well, how can we get more buildings on this site? Is this really the best use of this site? We've got all this outdoor space that we need to really maximize the sort of use of a site. And so buildings like this, the IBM, the research campus, recently mostly redeveloped, and here's another photo of it soon after its construction, seeing that beautiful bridge and the water features and the open plazas all being part of the building's design. and now being redeveloped as most of it as a shopping center with very few features being kept. In this one, they decided as an homage to the site, they used color panels on the facade of the Lowe's, but those are not actually the original panels. The thing that was a really important feature was this idea of transparency of the connection of the indoors and the outdoors, especially in this work of SOM. A lot of other architects practicing both on the East Coast and on the West Coast, the idea that the buildings would be you'd really see in and see out. So then what happens when the building's use, its program changes? In this one, fortunately, this building was landmarked, and there was a big discussion about when the bank left, and there's now a Joe Fresh store, I think is the one that's in here now. It's a clothing store that's taken over this bank. And they wanted to make actually fairly significant changes. They wanted to change the ceiling light and the lighting, do a lot of signage, change the location of escalators, and there was a big pushback from the Landmarks Commission in New York because obviously the inside of the building is what you see on the outside. But most of our ordinances are written just to protect the outside, and there are a lot of great modern buildings that aren't landmarked at all and have no protection. And so what you might do on the inside would just be done with a tenant interiors permit and would have a huge impact on the integrity of the building. So this idea of transparency, which, I mean, if you look at the buildings on the left of the slide or the far right, these more traditional buildings, I mean, if they did things on the inside, it's not going to be noticeable from the street at all. It isn't really going to impact the buildings, or the perception of those buildings, at least from the pedestrian's point of view. But changes in a building like this, if they had changed the lighting completely, it would have a huge impact on the building. So the transparency now is something that is being threatened. And the other big issue is energy efficiency. These buildings, these modern buildings, are done with all glass, mostly single glazed, not very energy efficient. It's a lot easier to retrofit a masonry structure and add insulation in the walls. And here, I mean, your choices for improving the energy efficiency, you could, if it's solar gain you're worried about, well, do you try to tint the glass, put a film on the glass? That's obviously going to have a big impact. Do you change the windows out to double glazing? I mean, you're affecting the integrity of the structure, and double glazing actually has kind of a pillowing impact. So it has a big change. Here's an example of the Crown Zellerbach in San Francisco. It still has its original curtain wall and its glass all intact, but at some point it will need to be replaced. And what are they going to, those systems will fail. They'll have water intrusion, and so how are they going to address those conditions? This original little pavilion is part of the structure. The signage is now kind of obscuring some of the transparency of the building, so it no longer has that kind of completely clean flow-through feeling. So the last kind of principal element we're going to talk about related to preservation of modern buildings and threats to these, and this idea that these original principles are what is actually making the buildings vulnerable, is the idea that form follows function. And this was a really important part of modern design, was the idea what you did in a building was going to drive the way it worked and the way it performed. That if you're going to be making cars in a building, if you have an assembly line, then the building should follow the assembly line. You need to have the proper lighting conditions for the functions that are being in the building, that they're all kind of related to the performance of what happens inside. The human functions that are happening in a building will kind of drive those buildings. And we see that a good example, I think, is transportation structures like airports. When the National Airlines terminal was done in New York by MPay, you wanted a very large welcoming area, which was your kind of arrivals, your area where you were departing from. You would check your bags in this grand hall, and then you would cross into another part of the terminal, which would be the departures area. So you had this very, very spacious, open, transparent grand hall, this fabulous kind of Mesian structure with an overhanging roof. But the way we use airports is different. The airlines no longer want this much space devoted to the kind of the front end. They want all the space that's going to be part of, after security, we're going to be kind of in a retail shopping environment. The size of airplanes is different. This was all designed for actually fairly small planes. So that we've got big impact in terms of the way that these types of buildings function. And unfortunately, when JetBlue took over this terminal, they decided it no longer met their needs. They didn't like the way this functioned. They were going to have a lot of passengers who would just be transferring in New York, wouldn't ever even use the larger part of the terminal, which was the front end. So this terminal was completely demolished. Theaters are often another example. In this Hanson building in Oklahoma City, each expression of the building, each programmatic element of the original Mummer stage, the smaller kind of black box spaces, the little meeting spaces, the smaller performance and practice rooms, each of them was actually expressed as an individual structure. This is like a programming diagram, like a bubble diagram that an architect would do, actually built as a built building. But then over time, the program of the Mummer stage is different. Their audiences are different. The way they use their buildings are different. And they felt they could no longer adapt, or rather than adapt, they demolished. Similar things happened to the Guthrie Theater. They felt very constrained by their original Ralph Rapson building and really confined by it, and they felt like in order to raise more money rather than for rehabilitation, that they couldn't raise enough money by rehabilitating, but they needed a shiny new Jean Nouvel structure, so they demolished this. A really big, important typology that this is, the form follows function, is hospital and medical center work. The Prentice Hospital was in the news quite a lot. There was a big effort to save this building, very innovative when it was designed in terms of the way the nursing stations worked and the healthcare functions worked, the room typologies. But Northwest University felt that it was outdated, that it didn't meet. They needed to grow. They felt it didn't accommodate their need for growth, and also they felt that the program was too constrained within the concrete walls of the building, so they unfortunately also demolished it. Edward Darrell Stone's Medical Center is another example, built all around courtyards, beautiful landscape, very elegant use of the concrete blocks and the kind of trellis, or the sort of open framework. But this too is a plan for demolition now because the university feels it's not meeting their capacity for growth. There's also the seismic ordinance, which requires the upgrading or replacement of hospitals in California. So rather than trying to upgrade this, the university plans to mostly demolish it. Sometimes there are small victories in these kind of programmatically driven buildings. The Neutra's Mariners Medical Center was under threat for a long time. When the medical group was leaving, there was concerns about adaptation, but the community has now, Huntington Beach has landmarked this structure, and it is seeing continued use as an office building. Sometimes we have examples of buildings that are very uniquely designed. Their program really reflects the owners in every kind of degree. And I think a really good example is the Cliff Mays Sunset Magazine headquarters in collaboration with Thomas Church, in which he designed, these buildings are all centered around courtyards in which Sunset could do work on their kind of gardens. What they would show in the magazine was all experimented and worked upon in the building, this idea of all the space facing the indoor-outdoor space, very much focused on the way Sunset would use the buildings and their specific program of the kitchens, that they would do all their recipe testing and other parts of this incredibly beautiful campus with large-scale gardens outside. It's a big concern to us now because Sunset is owned by Condé Nast, and they have just sold the headquarters, and they're moving to Oakland. So this is a site in which is probably 70% landscape, 70% garden, all very specifically designed for Sunset Magazine. And what will happen in a site like this is really unknown. I don't believe it has any particular designation or protection, so it would just be secret protections for these buildings. So now we're going to talk a little bit about maybe some reason for optimism, some strategies for preservation. We don't want to just be talking about things that are depressing in terms of some of the examples we've been showing you, and want to talk a little bit about successes as well.
Yeah, when we prepared this presentation, we added this section after going through all of the demolitions and talking about everything that's happening. We thought it would be important to point out not only what some strategies are for trying to preserve these types of buildings and landscapes, but also to show some success stories. So, there's kind of 4 things we've identified, and we'd love to hear in the Q&A if folks have other ideas for how to really work towards preserving important examples of modern design. So one thing is just advocacy and education. I think there's a real, because it's more recent past, and these resources, were in many cases built within all of our lifetimes, there's a lack of scholarship. There's scholarship, but there's a lack of breadth of scholarship about landscape and architecture from the modern era. I think it's changing, and I think, I know, for example, the kind of work I do in San Francisco, I'm constantly reviewing houses from the 60s by designers that we have no information about. And so we're slowly building context about different architecture and their work. For example, Campbell and Wong, an incredibly instrumental, important firm during this period, but because their archive is missing, I think it must be in private hands with the families or something. No one knows where it is. It's not at Berkeley like many of the other modern designers. So when their buildings come up for demolition, a lot of times the case is made, oh, well, they're not important. Well, that's absolutely not true. It's just there isn't a lot of scholarship about certain designers and certain kind of typologies of buildings and landscapes during this period. So just building on the scholarship and trying to help people understand what about the modern era designs are important, because they're not, it's something you really have to understand the context to really appreciate modern architecture. Andrew and I, of course, love it, but a lot of people don't like the aesthetics of modern architecture and design, and oftentimes if you can explain the context and the social circumstances in which the designs developed, people can start to say, oh, okay, wow, this was a really cutting edge, new idea with lots of promise and lots of optimism. I think some people kind of start to come around if they have that contextual information, but it's not apparent, and so it needs to be something that we as preservationists really focus on and try to raise the awareness and raise the discussion. Another issue is just the fact that in many of the demolition examples we showed you, it was just an all or nothing black and white decision. There was no attempt to rehabilitate the buildings. It was seen as easier to demolish and put all of that material in a landfill than to actually try to adapt the existing structures, which it's hard for me to understand from if we're in a movement of sustainability, I think it's very hard to understand how that can be the solution, but oftentimes it is at least perceived to be the most economical solution, which I don't know if you have thoughts on that. But it's often an all or nothing decision versus trying to adapt and reuse buildings and landscapes in a way that might fit current needs. Any thoughts on that?
No, I think, and that's certainly true, like at the urban scale, when sometimes we see these large redevelopment sites and cities are saying, well, let's redevelop them again, and their first move is, well, the traffic patterns aren't working, it's not friendly to pedestrians, let's just demolish it all, rather than saying, well, let's look at ways we can keep kind of the basis of the design ideas and look at ways to improve the road systems, make them more walkable. I mean, there are ways that we can incrementally make change rather than saying it's an all or nothing solution.
Another thing is just understanding that a lot of the systems that were developed for modern buildings and architecture and landscape architecture were new technologies and new ideas. and learning from these systems and their successes and failures, and kind of thinking about how they can be adapted or used for other, for the future, for looking at the future with these designs.
And I think what's happened a lot is over time, let's say over 50 years, there's often a lot of deferred maintenance, or there's often a lot of really bad decisions. So sometimes we'll see buildings that were naturally ventilated, but then over time the owners have decided, oh, it's drafty, we'll close up all those openings, and then suddenly the building isn't reperforming. It's like, oh, it's much too hot, it's not working anymore, the designers didn't know what they were doing. And so sometimes there are original systems that were already in place that have been changed or ignored or just not maintained. And sometimes I think, I have to say on a personal note that, for example, that UC Irvine project that I showed you, there's a certain amount of personal bitterness on that because we proposed on that project with the design that the brise soleil was failing, and we came up with a design in which we replaced them in kind using a better performing material, but that would maintain the same appearance. And we thought actually the very functional aspect of the fact that it was a complete sunshade, but the university rejected our design in favor of one which really didn't have any sunshades at all, and it seemed like they were lessening the environmental performance of what actually was designed as a very clever building to shelter the classrooms from the very strong sun in Irvine.
Yeah, so that brings, that's the point of the design innovation, as well as, again, talking about the idea of environmental sustainability. In order to address something like those traffic circles that Park Merced, there needs to be a creative solution proposed. We understand that grass and concrete is not water sustainable. It's problematic in a drought condition, and so there are ways to preserve the character of that type of design without completely replacing it, but it needs to be done in a creative way and based on an understanding of what is significant about the space in the first place.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we're saying also is, creativity, what we need is creativity from architecture and preservation professionals. And to a certain extent, the preservation professionals a lot of them aren't that used to working on modern buildings and don't understand them. They're used to working on buildings clad in terracotta or brick or masonry or wood. And so some of these materials they don't understand, they're not used to it. And a lot of architects are in this mindset, well, I'm approaching this building and I need to put my own stamp on it, and these systems have failed, and so I'm going to completely change it. And so what we're saying now is we need to look at these buildings more creatively and spend time really understanding the original design intent. But we do have some examples of creativity that we wanted to show you, both in terms of the advocacy, the education, and the approach.
Yeah, so these are our success stories, we think. So we did, at the CPF conference this year, we did a tour of this campus. It's the John Muir College at UCSD, originally designed by Robert Moser in the 1960s with Joseph Yamada, who was the landscape architect that did the master plan. And this was a really great tour. Robert Moser actually was there and did a little intro for us at the beginning. He's elderly, but very, very sharp and very proud of this project. This was a master landscape design campus within the larger UCSD campus. These buildings are very much this sort of, you could call them brutalist, I hate to categorize things, but they're sort of brutalist concrete structures. They're relatively low in scale, reasonable height, nothing that's towering over these courtyards. And the courtyard designs are very much integrated into the plan, and the trees and everything works together to create these little kind of insular campus within the larger campus. And we, for this tour, there's Glenn Schmidt Design Group in San Diego has completed a landscape restoration plan to bring back some of the landscape features that were incrementally changed over time. So, and the whole kind of understanding of this 60s campus as a historic resource was brought about through a Getty grant for the campus heritage plan that was completed several years ago. And so there's a real understanding by the campus, landscape architect and the planning team there about the importance of this site, and they're really working and managing it from a preservation-minded perspective. And they're not going to be adding any more buildings to this site. They added one apartment sort of student housing building as part right after that plan is completed, and they said, now it's full. We're not going to fill in any more of the landscape. We're not going to fill in the landscape because those elements are important. So we really see this as a good example of good stewardship and understanding of what is important about this space.
And the Oakland Museum of California, originally by Kevin Roche and Dan Kiley, a real incredible integration of landscape and architect, recently underwent fairly extensive rehabilitation and some minor additions and improvement of kind of the entry experience, done very sensitively by Mark Cavaniero. I think it exhibits a real understanding of what made this building kind of significant, its real character-defining features, its low-slung quality. So this, I think, is a very good example of looking at how to reinvigorate a modern building by keeping its main features. On a bigger scale, the Richmond Civic Center was originally designed by Timothy Pfluger, and the city of Richmond in the late 90s, early 2000s was looking, they decided that they needed a new civic center, that they were going to abandon the site completely, a large complex of multiple buildings, and that they should go to kind of a more suburban location rather than being downtown. There's concerns about security and other issues. But then after some extensive study and the work of architects and planners involved, they agreed instead to do a complete rehabilitation, that this is really what defined downtown Richmond. The Civic Center they were brought along to understand that this site is something that they couldn't just reproduce in some new suburban site, that the character of this as being part of downtown Richmond, its original modern design was important. So they did do a really lovely rehabilitation. This building complex by Edward Earl Stone was originally built as a pharmaceutical company, an office building, and laboratory research. When they moved out, there was concern about what would happen here, but now it's been rehabilitated and converted into a performing arts center. New condominium buildings have been built behind it, but some of the amenity spaces for the apartment buildings, for the condominium building, is actually within the structure. So it's a great rehabilitation that keeps those original screens, the landscape, the water features fairly intact. Some buildings you wonder, like, what are you going to do with this building that IBM built that was kind of based on the design of a punch card. It was a building where they were doing research and factory work, so they didn't really want to have a lot of windows and a lot of views out. And it's been converted into the Otis Art School. It makes great art space. So it was a very creative, adaptive reuse that kept the original exterior facade and the kind of random patterns of the windows. You can see in this picture on the right, it's actually an art installation, even though it looks like a bunch of, like the buildings being retrofitted. But it's actually an art installation in that space. So that kind of random pattern of the windows makes great studio space. Another recent example in Los Angeles, this is a Walton Beckett building that had been vacant for a while, not well used, converted into a charter school in which they kept the original kind of window, there's this really interesting kind of brise-soleil window pattern. So it's done, they did a very nice rehabilitation here. And a good example at UC Santa Cruz is also the expansion, renovation expansion of the McHenry Library. Large complex added onto in a very sensitive manner in which the glass and the concrete and its connection to the landscape is still maintained. So I think we're saying that there's hope, there's cause for optimism, there's hope, but it requires creativity. And I think we're happy to start taking questions.
Well, we're up in Northern California, so I actually am not super familiar with that. Do you know?
Wait, what was that? Wait, what was
Orange
it?
County Government Center?
In New York City, in New York, not in Orange County. It's in Orange, New York. It's this fantastic Paul Rudolph building that in upstate New York, county building, and the county had determined that it wasn't really serving their needs. They were concerned about waterproofing, other issues, and they just decided they were going to demolish it. And there was actually a donor, somebody who agreed, who said they would buy the building from the county, build them a new building, and they still just refused. They rejected that because they felt it was a brutalist building, and it wasn't. It's in, I think, is it Goshen, New York? I think is. So that I think there, it's hard to say what the lessons from that are. I think there was a huge outcry. I think maybe the lesson is that I think when people have opinions, that it's sometimes hard. They don't like to be preached at, and so I think part of it was that they felt it was their building, and they felt that they didn't like it. They just had a sort of an aversion to its architectural design, and that in fact this big coalition that formed to save it, I think that almost made them bristle because they felt they were being preached at a little bit. But it's hard.
I think too it's brutalism, right? So right now brutalism is the most hated era of architecture, except for maybe postmodern. I don't know. They're both kind of like at this weird tipping point where brutalism came kind of a little bit after the mid-century modern era. It's more of the 60s and 70s designs. And it's interesting, the conversations that I've heard about these kinds of buildings where people just aesthetically don't like them. They just think that they're cold and unfriendly. There's not enough glass. I don't agree with that. But again, I think we're the anomaly in some cases. And there's a lack of understanding or education or kind of advocacy to show the importance of those buildings within the larger canon of architecture. And, it's happening. I think as a lot of them are being proposed for demolition, people are starting to raise the alarm about why they're important. But I think it hasn't quite gelled yet. Not in the way that we understand mid-century modern architecture. Like no one's going to say the Eames house is not important.
Yeah, I think the thing that I find still surprising is that we are still seeing at this point in 2015 that often work of architects that are seen as highly significant architects, very significant work, well-designed, beautiful buildings. I think, for example, that John Johansson theater in Oklahoma City, which I saw maybe 5 years ago, and I thought, wow, this is a fantastic building. I couldn't stop photographing it. And then to find out that just a year and a half ago that was demolished, that was being demolished. It's still so surprising to see these kinds of significant works being demolished, which I think you wouldn't see in work of maybe earlier periods. So I think that there's still a big advocacy and education that we need to do, and I think to a certain extent in the major urban centers in California and Los Angeles and San Francisco, there's much more sensitivity in planning departments among the sort of planners and architects here than in these smaller communities. And that's also, I think, what happened in the Paul Rudolph case. It was a smaller community, not so educated about modern architecture.
Well, I wonder too, I think, there's many reasons for that idea, but I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, if you look at especially suburban development or, development in the 40s and 50s, we were infilling sites still at that point. Like if you look at San Francisco at the Sanborn maps from, 1920s, and then you look again at 1950, they're literally filling in neighborhoods and available lots to build on. And I think now we don't have that luxury. And so a lot of times the more recent past buildings, the low scale buildings, things that often, are characteristic of modern buildings, they are targeted for the demolition in order to increase density. That's definitely what we're seeing in San Francisco, as we are in a huge building boom right now. Those kind of sites are definitely targeted for densification. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's important.
Yeah, and I would say when the Alcoa building that we showed you by SOM, when that went through, and that because it was a redevelopment site actually didn't go through the planning department, so it just kind of, the work just started. But the first question that was asked of the owners, well, why didn't you hire SOM? They've got a huge practice in San Francisco, and I think they likely would have been more sensitive to that building than a sort of a random architect.
We've seen that. I think we've seen that. I'm not sure how much longer we will see that for Modern Resources, as many of the original designers are now, if they're still alive, they're in their 90s, you know, 80s and 90s. But I know Robert Royston was very actively involved in the Santa Clara Central Park and some other projects that were his original designs from the 40s and 50s. He was still working on them. I mean, he was still working up until, you know, he passed away, and I think it was 2003 or 2007.
Thank you, Andrew and Gretchen. I will now mention to everybody that's dialed in and also everybody that's listening in.
That were very
now's the time for questions. You can either do it through the Q&A box on the bottom left-hand side or through the chat box on the left.
Doug Nelson and others, like these guys who really understand
just to get
the importance
started,
of their firm
maybe I'll ask
in that
the two
historical development, and they really, I think, are very sensitive
if you're familiar with the
when
Orange
they
County
work on
Government
projects
Center and
that
what's going on
seek
there,
to adapt some of these
and
original work.
what maybe if you learned
you
one
don't always
lesson
see
from
it,
that
but when that happens,
whole
I think it
saga,
is very positive in
what
general.
would you think that lesson would be?
Are there other questions, John?
It's a Paul Rudolph.
Yeah, that was actually, that's the Pfluger firm. So I'm not sure if Timothy Pfluger at that point was still involved in that project, but it was kind of the towards the tail end of the Pfluger firm, and I think it was kind of moving more into international style and kind of modern. So it's, I mean, it's late 1940s, so it's a pretty important modern work.
But that's not unusual. I mean, Thomas Church started out in a very, you know, Victorian, traditional European style of gardens, and he really was one of the ones who began the modern design movement. I think because the modern period of design was so different than what had come before, we did see a lot of designers cross over and really become part of the developments of those types of aesthetics. For example, we showed Park Merced, which is something I know a lot about because I studied it a long time ago, and Leonard Schultze, who was the architectural designer on that project, he's most known for very elaborate, very ornamental hotels in New York City, like the tall, high-rise, you know, hotels that are super fancy and, you know, were built in the turn of the century. He kind of crossed over later in his career and started designing these cruciform towers and these simple box garden apartments for the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, who commissioned that project and commissioned projects all across the United States that he designed many of them. And so you really see these architects, for different reasons, philosophical reasons, they embrace modern as a design aesthetic, and also, you know, that's what people wanted in that period. That's the type of style they wanted to see. So I think a lot of designers had to embrace modernism in order to continue practicing, which is interesting. What's our question here? How do we advocate an appreciation of mid-century modern design to the general public?
I think that's it's an important point, and I think it needs to be done by all of us in many different ways. I mean, some of it is really getting exposure to neighborhoods and sites that are maybe less well known, that aren't just the iconic buildings. And I think, for example, Doko Momo a few years ago did tours of Diamond Heights, which is a redevelopment area in San Francisco, kind of windy streets, houses with garages, not necessarily the most pedestrian-friendly environment, but a really great collection of modern buildings. And we got inside quite a few of the houses. And that made a big impact on people coming, because their impression of Diamond Heights is just what you see from the street. But the moment you could get in the houses and see how open they were and kind of airy and the great views, it really made a big impression. So trying to get people into sites that aren't well known, and also having people who are passionate about modern architecture be the ones kind of talking about what makes them great, what are the original ideas behind them.
I think also what I've noticed, and it's kind of through more popular culture, is there is an interest in this time period. You know, we have the success of shows like Mad Men. People love Mad Men. You know, it's all about the fashion and the art and the cultural craziness that was going on in the 50s and 60s. We see, I think, a resurgence in graphic design right now where some of these aesthetics of the mid-century modern period are showing up in design, you know, furniture design, people's interest in antiques of this time period. So I think there's also this appreciation for the design, maybe not the architecture specifically, but if we can kind of triangulate and come at it from different angles and help people see that that context is really what created the architecture, I think you might capture some more interest that way as well.
Yeah, and I mean sometimes we see things that are, I find surprising. For example, when JetBlue took over that terminal, that original National Airlines terminal, I thought, oh, that's great. Here we've got this hip, modern, cool airline, and they're going to really understand this building. But no, in the end, they're like, no, we don't like the building. We want something of our own, which is, you would think that a company like JetBlue would be appreciative of it, but that wasn't the case.
Celebrating that history instead of turning away from it.
Great answer.
But
Thank
I noticed
you.
even Sunset Magazine,
we also had a question come in
maybe like
from
5 years ago when they were starting to re-show old vintage covers from the 60s, and they would put them in the magazine, and so there's more of like awareness of some of these companies of their own history too, which they can use as a marketing technique.
The examples are the state buildings at 7th and P and the SMUD
Keep thinking there's more questions coming in.
Both designed by Dreyfus and Blackford. Oh, I guess it's more of a comment. Yeah, so I guess it's a comment.
Yeah.
It's actually
in the process.
Well, it's slated. It's actually much worse than that. It's mostly going to be demolished. All of the low-rise structures will be demolished. All of the courtyards will be demolished. The only thing that will be saved will be the towers. And sadly enough, the site is owned by two separate owners, by the University of San Francisco State University owns part of it, and a private developer owns the other part, and they have entitlements to do that, both projects. Both the university are actually planning now, they've just done an analysis of their housing and they decided they need to do a lot more housing on the Park Merced site. And the private owner is planning on doing a much, they're basically tripling the size, the number of units in there by doing all mid and high-rise structures.
Yeah, and the private development portion of that went through an environmental impact report process maybe 7 years ago, and it's been approved, so there's no further potential for advocacy.
But it was found to be a historic resource for the purpose of CEQA, and so then mitigation measures were adopted, which are HABS documentation.
HABS and HALS, and so they're in the process of doing that work right now of documenting what's there before they demolish it. And it's actually, I think it's interesting to note that it's the largest singly owned parcel in San Francisco. So it's a huge development potential.
It looks like one is coming in, but maybe while we're waiting on this, I was going to ask a question of my own.
Giant swath of land in the city to
looking at the Timothy Pfluger
but
building
I would say,
from Richmond,
as another note, it's also
like
very tragic because it's probably the largest project that Thomas Church did.
And I'm wondering what inspired him to move more towards that style,
is different. There's a different design, and I don't know how many of those courtyards there are.
Hundreds,
There's just they're incredible works of art and architecture and landscape design. So it's a very sad thing that we're losing that entire complex.
Yeah, and of all of the MetLife insurance company subdivisions that they did, there was about a dozen of them across the United States, and the ones in California were designed in the modern aesthetic. It's really the most intact of all of those, and that you could say it's the best example, and yet it is the one it is being demolished. Park La Brea is exactly the same design, but has been very modified over time, including an addition of a new section of the site. So.
But I don't think Church didn't do all the courtyards in Park La Brea, did he?
No, he did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So anyway, that's one of our non-success stories.
Yeah.
Is there another question here? Why don't we see more local, state, and National Register designations. You don't see it in San Diego. Sorry, I'm trying to...
Lots of lip surface on how cool the buildings are, but no one does anything to even initiate a citywide survey. I mean, we are seeing that in some places there's interest. San Francisco, about 2 years ago, did a modern context statement. So that was the first move, and now has been working on a citywide survey. Los Angeles has been working on a citywide survey for a long time now.
Yeah, there is, though, you're right, though, there's not very many, especially modern landscapes. We're seeing more being put on the National Register, but there aren't many. I think there's 4 Lawrence Halprin landscapes on the National Register, you know, even though he did so many projects. It's increasing, but it's only recently that we've started to see people designating these types of resources. I think we might be at our time. John, are we? Okay. Thank you all for your chat comments. I appreciated that during the talk. It's good. Barbara was waiting with...
What was the example of the circle of landscaping, originally flat and now standard issue drought tolerant? That was very funny. That was Park Merced.
It was a traffic circle at Park Merced in San Francisco. Great.
Okay, Melissa. Yeah, there's one more question that Melissa was asking through the Q&A box. Isn't Park Merced slated to be infilled and lose all of its open spaces?